The story begins in the middle of a chaotic flood, with roaring waters tearing through a forest. The camera pans to a lone fisherman, Mark, struggling to steer his small boat against the powerful currents. Amid the chaos, a faint, desperate cry breaks through the sound of the rushing water. Mark looks around, squinting through the misty rain, and spots something clinging to a piece of driftwood, a tiny bear cub, soaked and trembling, fighting for survival. With suspense building, the audience is left wondering, will Mark take the risk to save the cub in these treacherous waters, or will the rising flood claim them both? From this intense opening, the story rewinds to explain how both Mark and the cub found themselves in this heart-stopping moment, setting the stage for an incredible tale of courage, kindness, and connection. As Mark paddles his small boat cautiously through the swirling floodwaters, he hears the faint, heart-wrenching cries of an animal in distress. Straining to see through the rain and debris, he spots a fragile figure, a baby bear clutching a piece of driftwood, barely afloat, its tiny paws gripped desperately, its eyes wide with terror. The realization hits Mark. The cub has been swept away from its family and is now helpless against the merciless currents. His heart aches as he watches the little bear struggle to stay above water. However, rescuing the cub isn't simple. Raging floodwaters, floating branches, and unpredictable whirlpools make it a dangerous gamble. Mark hesitates, battling his own fear of the elements and the uncertainty of how the cub might react. But as the bear lets out another desperate cry, Mark makes a life-changing decision. He can't leave it behind. Gripping his oar tightly, he maneuvers toward the cub, determined to defy the odds and give it a chance at survival. The rain had been relentless for days, flooding rivers and spilling them across vast stretches of the forest. Mark, a seasoned fisherman, had seen his share of storms, but nothing like this. His small wooden boat rocked against the unforgiving current as he navigated the swollen waters. The familiar sights of the riverbanks were gone, replaced by a chaotic landscape of debris and swirling floodwaters. It was a scene of devastation, but Mark was out there for a reason. He couldn't sit idly by while the wilderness he loved so deeply was ravaged. As he scanned the horizon, something unusual caught his attention. Amid the floating branches and rushing waters, a faint cry echoed through the air. He paused, straining to listen against the roar of the river. The sound wasn't human. It was high-pitched, raw, and filled with panic. His heart quickened as he followed the sound, steering his boat closer to the source. Then he saw it. A tiny figure clinging desperately to a piece of driftwood. It was a baby bear, its drenched fur plastered to its small body, trembling as it fought to stay afloat. The cub's wide, terrified eyes locked onto Mark, a silent plea for help that pierced straight through him. It wasn't just the helplessness of the creature, it was the sheer vulnerability, the way it clung to life despite the overwhelming odds. Mark hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. Approaching a wild animal, even a young one, was risky, especially in such unpredictable conditions. The floodwaters were fierce, and one wrong move could overturn his boat. But how could he turn his back on this defenseless creature? The cub let out another weak cry, its tiny paws gripping the driftwood as if it were the only thing tethering it to life. He took a deep breath, gripping his oar tightly. "All right, little one," he murmured to himself. "Let's get you out of there." Slowly, he guided his boat closer, his eyes never leaving the cub. Each stroke of the oar felt heavy, the current resisting him at every turn. As he approached, the cub's cries grew louder, almost as if it could sense hope approaching. When he was finally within reach, Mark reached out with a makeshift hook to pull the driftwood closer. The cub flinched, its instincts telling it to fear the unknown. Mark spoke softly, his voice calm and steady, trying to soothe the frightened animal. "I'm here to help," he said, inching closer until the driftwood was alongside his boat. The cub's trembling intensified as Mark carefully extended his hand. He knew he had to act quickly but gently, ensuring the cub wouldn't panic and slip into the water. With one swift but cautious motion, he scooped the bear cub into the boat. It let out a startled cry, but once it felt the solid surface beneath its paws, it collapsed into a shivering heap. Mark wrapped the cub in a spare jacket, shielding it from the rain and offering some warmth. As he looked down at the fragile creature, his heart swelled with a mix of relief and determination. This was only the beginning. The real challenge lay ahead. But in that moment, Mark knew he had done the right thing. He couldn't save the entire forest, but he could save this little life. And that was enough to keep him going. Mark's heart raced as he steadied his boat in the flood's relentless current. The baby bear, clinging desperately to the drifting log, looked more fragile with every passing second. Its fur, soaked to the skin, clung to its tiny frame as its cries for help grew weaker. The floodwaters surged, pushing the log further away, and Mark knew he had only moments to act. Gritting his teeth, he fought the current, rowing closer inch by inch. The boat groaned under the strain, its small motor sputtering against the rushing water. Every moment was a battle, but Mark's focus never wavered. He couldn't abandon the cub. Its terrified eyes, locked onto his, seemed to plead with him to keep going. Finally, Mark was close enough to see the cub's trembling paws gripping the slippery log. He grabbed a rope and fashioned a loop, tossing it toward the driftwood. The first attempt missed, the current sweeping the rope away. Mark cursed under his breath, but quickly pulled the rope back and tried again. This time the loop snagged the log, and he began pulling it toward the boat. The cub let out a small, panicked growl as the log shifted. Mark spoke softly, trying to calm it. "Easy there, little one. I've got you." His voice, steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him, seemed to reach the cub. It stopped struggling, watching him with wide, wary eyes. As the log neared the boat, Mark reached out carefully, extending his arm toward the cub. The bear flinched, its instincts warning it to stay away from the unfamiliar figure. Mark hesitated for a moment, then slowly took off his rain-soaked jacket. He held it out, hoping the soft fabric would seem less threatening. The cub hesitated but didn't retreat. Seizing the moment, Mark leaned further and scooped the bear into his arms. It was lighter than he'd expected, its small frame trembling violently from cold and exhaustion. As soon as it was in the boat, Mark wrapped the cub in his jacket, shielding it from the relentless rain. The cub let out a faint whimper, then nestled into the warmth. Relief washed over Mark, but he knew the danger wasn't over. The floodwaters were still rising, and the currents were as unpredictable as ever. He turned his boat around, gripping the motor's handle tightly. His arms ached from the effort, but he pushed through, steering toward higher ground. The cub remained curled in his jacket, its tiny body heaving with each breath. Mark glanced down periodically, silently willing it to hang on. As the boat neared a patch of dry land, a wave of hope surged through him. He could see the shoreline, a safe haven amidst the chaos. Finally, the boat scraped against the muddy bank, and Mark jumped out, cradling the cub in his arms. He carried it to a sheltered spot under a cluster of trees and set it down gently. The cub looked up at him, its eyes no longer filled with fear, but with something softer, trust. Mark smiled, his exhaustion melting away. Against all odds, he had saved the tiny life. The floodwaters might have claimed much, but this bear cub's story wouldn't end there. It was a moment he'd never forget, a reminder of the power of compassion and determination, even in the face of nature's fury. As the days passed, the bond between Mark and the baby bear grew in ways he hadn't anticipated. After the dramatic rescue, Mark had taken the exhausted cub to his small cabin on the edge of the forest, where he could care for it until he figured out what to do next. What began as a temporary act of kindness quickly turned into an unexpected companionship that warmed his heart. At first, the cub was wary, retreating to the corner of the small enclosure Mark had prepared for it. Its tiny body trembled whenever he approached, and it kept a cautious eye on his every movement. Mark understood the cub's fear. After all, it had been through a terrifying ordeal. He moved slowly, speaking in a gentle, soothing tone every time he entered the room. "Hey there, little one. It's just me. No one's gonna hurt you." Mark's patience began to pay off. By the second day, the cub started responding to his voice. It would tilt its head, its wide, curious eyes following him as he moved around. Mark made sure to keep his movements calm, avoiding anything that might frighten the cub. He offered small pieces of fish, which the cub cautiously sniffed before nibbling on. Seeing it eat brought a smile to Mark's face, a sign that the cub was starting to trust him. As the cub grew more comfortable, its personality began to emerge. Mark quickly learned that it was playful, even mischievous. One morning, as he prepared breakfast, He turned around to find the cub pawing at his boots, tugging at the laces as if they were toys. Mark chuckled and gently scooped the cub up, setting it on his lap. The bear let out a soft growl, more of a purr than a threat, and nestled into his flannel shirt. Their bond deepened during long walks in the woods near the cabin. Mark wanted the cub to get used to its natural surroundings, knowing that one day he might have to let it go. But for now, these walks were their special time together. The cub would follow at his heels, occasionally stopping to investigate a bush or chase after a fluttering leaf. Mark couldn't help but laugh at its clumsy antics, marveling at how quickly it had recovered from its ordeal. At night, the cub would curl up in a makeshift bed Mark had prepared near the fireplace. Its soft, rhythmic breathing became a comforting sound in the otherwise silent cabin. Mark often found himself watching it sleep, marveling at the connection they'd formed. Despite being from two completely different worlds, they had found solace in each other. As the days turned into weeks, Mark couldn't deny the growing attachment he felt. The cub wasn't just a rescue anymore. It had become a companion, a little piece of the wild that had found its way into his heart. And though he knew their time together was temporary, he cherished every moment, knowing it would leave an indelible mark on his life. Just as Mark and the baby bear had settled into their unexpected routine, an unforeseen challenge threatened to upend their fragile peace. It started one crisp morning when Mark stepped out of his cabin, the cub toddling behind him as usual. The sun was just rising, casting golden hues over the forest, and everything seemed serene. But as they wandered deeper into the woods for their usual walk, Mark noticed something unusual, a faint set of tracks that didn't belong to the cub or any other harmless forest creature. Kneeling down, Mark examined the prints carefully. They were large, clawed, and unmistakable. Another bear, likely an adult, had passed through the area recently. A chill ran down his spine. He knew the risks of having a cub with him in a region frequented by fully grown bears, particularly a mother searching for her lost young. The presence of a protective adult bear could spell danger for both him and the cub. The cub, oblivious to Mark's concerns, frolicked in the fallen leaves nearby. Mark stood and scanned the surrounding woods, his senses heightened. Every rustle of leaves or crack of a twig put him on edge. He had grown attached to the little bear, but now he wondered if keeping it with him was putting them both at risk. Over the next few days, the signs of danger grew more frequent. One evening, as Mark prepared dinner, the cub's ears perked up. It let out a low, uncertain growl and backed toward him. Mark followed its gaze and froze. Through the window, he spotted movement. Just a shadow at first, but then the distinct shape of a large bear lumbering through the trees near the cabin. Mark's heart pounded. He knew bears were territorial, and an encounter with an adult bear could be life-threatening. He quickly secured the cub inside the cabin, shutting the windows and bolting the door. The cub whimpered, sensing the tension in the air, and huddled close to him. That night, Mark stayed awake, listening for any sounds that might indicate the adult bear was still nearby. He couldn't shake the growing fear that he might be putting the cub in harm's way. It wasn't just the risk of another bear attack. He also began to question whether keeping the cub in a human environment was the right thing to do. While their bond had grown strong, the cub was still a wild animal, and its place was ultimately in the wild. The next morning, Mark made a decision. He would need to find a way to reunite the cub with its kind, whether by locating its mother or seeking help from wildlife authorities. But this wasn't a simple task. The forest was vast, and finding the cub's mother, if she was even alive, was like searching for a needle in a haystack. As he prepared for this new challenge, Mark couldn't ignore the ache in his chest. He had grown to love the cub, and the thought of letting it go was painful. But deep down, he knew it was the only way to ensure the cub's safety and future. Determined yet conflicted, Mark steeled himself for the journey ahead, knowing the bond they had formed would give him the strength to face whatever lay ahead. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature, but Mark's focus remained entirely on the baby bear toddling beside him. Each step forward was a mix of relief and anxiety. He had spent the last few days planning this moment, a journey to a wildlife rescue center where the cub would be safe, cared for, and possibly reunited with other bears. The thought of parting with the cub tugged at his heart, but the dangers of the wild had grown too great, and he knew this was the right thing to do. The journey wasn't easy. The forest terrain was rugged, with uneven ground, steep inclines, and dense underbrush. Mark had packed a small backpack with supplies, including water and food for both himself and the cub. Despite the challenging path, the cub remained close, occasionally stopping to sniff the air or paw at the leaves. Mark smiled at its innocence, but his grip on the walking stick tightened as he remained alert for any signs of danger. Midway through their trek, a sudden downpour began, drenching them both in minutes. The cub let out a startled cry as the rain intensified, and Mark quickly sought shelter beneath a cluster of large trees. He wrapped the cub in his jacket, shielding it from the cold. "We're almost there, little one," he whispered reassuringly, stroking its damp fur. The cub looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes, and for a moment, Mark felt a pang of doubt. Was he doing the right thing by letting it go? The rain finally subsided, leaving the forest drenched and the ground slippery. As they continued, the cub grew tired, its small legs struggling to keep up. Mark didn't hesitate. He scooped the cub into his arms and carried it. The bear's weight was considerable, but Mark pushed on, driven by the thought of reaching their destination. As they neared the edge of the forest, the sight of a narrow dirt road brought a wave of relief. The rescue center was just a short distance away. The cub, sensing a change, squirmed slightly in his arms, but soon settled. Mark could see the faint outline of the center in the distance, a small building surrounded by enclosures and open land. Reaching the center's gate, Mark was met by a staff member who immediately noticed the cub in his arms. "You've done a brave thing," the man said, gesturing for Mark to follow him inside. The cub clung to Mark as they entered, reluctant to leave the safety of his arms. It took gentle coaxing from the staff to separate the two, and as the cub was carried away, it let out a small, pitiful cry. The morning had come too soon for Mark. The bright, crisp air of the forest greeted him as he stepped out of the cabin, but his mind was clouded with uncertainty. His eyes scanned the forest path one last time as he prepared for the most difficult decision he had ever made. The cub, now a little more confident and curious, padded beside him, oblivious to the heavy burden Mark carried. Over the past few weeks, their bond had grown stronger, more than he could have ever imagined. The little bear had gone from trembling in fear to walking by his side, trusting him without hesitation. Yet, now Mark was faced with a choice: to continue keeping the cub in the safety of his home, or to let go and let the wild take its course. The decision had not come easily. There had been days when Mark had considered keeping the cub with him, where the thought of leaving it alone in the wild, vulnerable and helpless, seemed impossible. The cub had become more than just an animal in his care. It had become a friend, a companion. He had shared his mornings, his quiet moments by the fire, and even his meals with the bear. He had learned to look after the cub, to protect it, to feed it. But Mark knew that what he was offering wasn't enough. The cub belonged in the wild, with others of its kind. The floods, the dangers, and the eventual reality that would force him to let go. It was all weighing on him now. As they walked down the familiar path to the wildlife center, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking away from something irreplaceable. The forest that had once been a place of solitude and peace now felt like a constant reminder of the little bear he had saved, and the overwhelming connection they had shared. Every step felt heavy, the words of goodbye weighing more with each passing moment. He had always known that this day would come. The flood had brought them together, and now the time had come for him to let the cub go, to allow it to return to where it truly belonged. He glanced down at the cub, whose playful curiosity hadn't faded since they'd begun their walk. The cub sniffed at the bushes along the path, its small body scampering from one tree to the next, looking up at him every so often with a soft, trusting gaze. Its innocence was undeniable, its reliance on Mark, his warmth, his protection, so clear. The bond between them had grown to a point where it was hard for Mark to imagine life without the cub at his side. But despite the ache in his chest, Mark knew this was the right thing to do. As they approached the wildlife center, the sight of the large gates felt like an insurmountable wall. Mark felt the weight of every step, the ground beneath him growing heavier as he drew closer to the place where he would leave the cub behind. The staff had prepared for his arrival, and as they opened the gates, Mark's heart sank even further. He knew the cub would be well cared for here, but it still felt like he was about to lose something far more precious than he could explain. A gentle voice greeted him from the other side of the gates. A staff member, who had been expecting Mark, stepped forward with a warm but empathetic smile. "You must be Mark," she said softly. "We've been expecting you." Mark nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He carefully placed the cub down, its small legs wobbly as it looked up at him, sensing something was about to change. The cub let out a small cry, a sound that made Mark's heart break all over again. Its eyes, innocent and filled with trust, searched his face as though asking him what was happening, why it was being taken away from him. "I'm so sorry," Mark whispered, kneeling down beside the cub. His hand gently rested on its back, and for a brief moment they shared an unspoken connection. He stroked the cub's fur, feeling the familiar warmth that had once comforted him on lonely nights. "You'll be okay. This is the right thing. I promise you." The staff member, a woman with experience in wildlife care, slowly approached the cub. She crouched down to Mark's level, speaking softly to the bear as she gently reached out to lift it. The cub hesitated for a moment, but, sensing the calm in the woman's presence, allowed itself to be held. It looked back at Mark one last time. Mark stood, his hands shaking as he watched the cub being carried away. Every fiber of his being screamed to take it back, to keep the cub with him, safe and sound. But he knew better than to give in to his emotions. This wasn't about his attachment. It was about the cub's future. He watched as the staff member gently placed the cub in a quiet enclosure, away from the noise of the center. The cub looked around for a moment, its gaze lingering on the place it had just come from, before it curled into a ball and rested. The exhaustion of the past few days seemed to catch up with it all at once. As Mark turned to leave, he felt a lump in his throat, his chest constricting with grief. He had always known that this day would come, but it didn't make the pain any easier. The forest that had been a sanctuary now felt empty, his home devoid of the little companion that had shared his life for so long. But as he took one last look at the cub, now resting peacefully in its new home, Mark felt a sense of relief wash over him. The cub was safe. It would be cared for, nurtured, and eventually released back into the wild when it was ready. It wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter in the cub's life. With a heavy but hopeful heart, Mark turned away from the enclosure, stepping back into the world he knew. The cub would find its place in the wild, just as it was meant to. And Mark, though heartbroken, knew he had done the right thing. The bond they shared would remain in his heart forever, a reminder of the powerful connection between man and nature, and the healing that can